Some big developments with Yahoo today as new CEO Scott Thompson tries to get the struggling internet giant back on track. Bloomberg has learned Yahoo's talks with its Asian partners, Alibaba and SoftBank, have hit an impasse. Meantime, Yahoo shareholder Third Point, led by hedge fund manager Dan Loeb, announced plans to nominate several new directors to Yahoo's board, continuing a recent boardroom shakeup. Our senior West Coast correspondent Jon Erlichman is in the newsroom with more. Jon, the Yahoo news continues.
It does, Emily, and the agent for change at Yahoo has been this individual, Dan Loeb. I mean, you could argue that all the changes that we've seen, Scott Thompson taking over as the CEO, some board members saying they're not going to stand for re-election, including the chairman, Roy Bostock, and this decision to try and swap out the Asian assets, that none of this would have happened if Dan Loeb hadn't bought a big stake in the company and sent scolding letters to the chairman, Roy Bostock, to say, make more moves. In this filing today, where he nominates a few people for the board, he says, look, I like the changes that have been taking place so far and the boardroom changes that are taking place, but I'd like to see more. For example, when they announced that they were going to bring in a couple of new board members, he said they have a technology background. You guys still get a lot of money from advertising. You're partly a media business, so that's why he's nominating Michael Wolff, formerly of MTV. You can also see Jeff Zucker, formerly of NBC Universal. Harry Wilson is an interesting pick. The argument here is that this is somebody who has restructuring experience, and this is a company that needs restructuring. He was involved in working with the Treasury and turning around General Motors. What you don't see on this list, Emily, are names from Silicon Valley. Now, we do know that Dan Loeb did make a trip out here as part of this process. One thing about Silicon Valley is it is a pretty clubby place, and nobody wants to look as if they're throwing mud at their rival companies, and we'll continue to watch that part of the story.
And Dan Loeb, we know he's a pretty strategic guy. Interesting timing he'd make this announcement after this disappointing news that talks about the Asian assets have stalled.
Yeah, I mean, if you did want to get shareholders on your side, this would seem like the day to do it, right? We have nothing to back up that there is timing here of this story coming out today about the Asia situation and this Dan Loeb announcement. Look, it takes a long time, and we know that Dan Loeb has been working for a long time to get this slate together. We're also hearing that he's working with McKinsey Partners as a proxy solicitor in this process. The interesting additional note is that he can't technically, at least according to the bylaws from Yahoo, submit this to Yahoo until at least February 24th. So he's doing it about 10 days ahead of time, perhaps to drum up some market interest in this story, maybe even to cut a deal. For more on this story, we're joined now by Laura Martin, an analyst at Needham Co, who covers Yahoo very closely. She's at her office in Pasadena, California, and she joins us via Skype. Laura, where do we begin? Why don't we start with the Asia part of the story, because that was what was moving the stock early today. The fact that these two sides seem to have reached a point where they can't go on. What was your reaction to that?
You know, I think it's hard on shareholders because the last time we tried to get a deal with Jack Ma, he just took the assets first and let us know later, and then we had to negotiate from a position of weakness. So I think there is some concern here that when a deal breaks down, that maybe shareholders in America will never get fair value for the Asian assets.
This is an important point. I mean, the distrust between these two companies, Alibaba and Yahoo, has been going on for some time. It's below the board level. It's company employees having to deal with each other, at least in the past. That's been part of the history of these companies. So you're suggesting it's not the tax factors, it's not what assets might come back, it's that maybe Yahoo feels like it's not going to get the best deal in this?
Yeah, I would suggest that there's probably a difference in perception of perceived negotiating leverage, that Yahoo thinks it's owed what it's owed under contract, but Jack Ma's already once taken an asset that under contract it couldn't, and then Yahoo had to try to negotiate value for it. So I think there's very real risk here that rather than getting what Yahoo may perceive is an not fair value for its current holding, that it gets even less 2 years from now. And I think that's something that Dan Loeb will follow up on, because $1 today, you know what it's worth. $1 2 years from now, it's totally unclear what it's worth, especially in China.
Just before we switch to Dan Loeb, you ultimately think a deal will get done with Alibaba?
You know, I think I would go on the record as saying the only way a deal will get done for Alibaba is if there's a second bidder. Otherwise, Alibaba will try to steal these assets from Yahoo, and it will make it very tough on the board with their fiduciary duties. They need a second or third bidder And then I think you can get Jack Ma to behave in an economically reasoned way and pay fair value for this stake to get it back, because he certainly doesn't want anyone else to own it other than him.
Before we go, I want to talk a little bit about Dan Loeb. I just highlighted that he technically can't put these nominees for the board forward for another 10 days. What do you think about the timing here?
You know, I got to tell you, I think this board is fascinating because, as you know, Carol really wanted to take Yahoo back towards media. And that's what these board members, like you said, MTV, Zucker of NBC, it very much feels like a media strategic focus that Loeb is presenting. And yet Scott Thompson, the new CEO, has said, no, 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 we're going to move towards data, selling data. And he's really moving away from the advertising and media side of the business because he has no experience there. So to me, suddenly Scott Thompson's boss, which is the board, if Loeb is successful, would suddenly have much more of a financial, let's call it financial discipline, which is, you know, public market value expert plus plus the restructuring guy and a bunch of media guys. And those would be his boss.
Well, we'll have to watch and see how it plays out. Laura, thanks as always for your time. Laura Martin of Needham Co joining us from Pasadena.